What you're about to watch is brought to you by Means TV, the world's premier worker-owned streaming service that my channel has now joined. So don't go anywhere after the video ends. To celebrate, I have an update and a juicy gift for you. Now, let's begin.
The world is going to become one world government.
One world government, this one world economy. Are they going to take Christ or are they going to follow the Antichrist?
Great Reset, is it setting the stage for a future global system ruled over by you-know-who, the Antichrist?
Toward a one world economy, bank, and government.
This is a spiritual battle, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The one world government wants to keep tabs on what you eat and where you go.
This would be a government, a world government, where you don't get to vote on anybody. This is everybody's worst nightmare.
What's your favorite sci-fi setting? Warhammer, Star Wars, maybe Star Trek. It doesn't matter whether it's the grim dark future, a galaxy far, far away, or an intergalactic interspecies socialist federation. They all share one similarity, to a greater or smaller extent, a united humanity. Humanity under one banner. And sure, there's room made for separatists, factional infighting, and ideological disagreements. But there's no believable, long-term spacefaring future where humans still segregate themselves under the banner of country, ethnicity, or race. Why is it then that we still divide our species into tribes, often with pride, when we are very capable of not only imagining but understanding the necessity for unification? Is almost every country we know today not a product of the idea that thousands, millions, billions can share a common identity so strong as for them to call themselves American, Chinese, Russian, French, Kenyan, Argentinian, Korean, or Greek? An idea that would make the many scattered tiny tribes of our ancient past confused beyond understanding. How could so many identify as one? How do you even manage such a large union? What's in it for the cities or villages? Those are just a few of the many questions our ancestors would ask. So, following that very same historical process, why should it be so hard for us today to begin thinking of an even greater union, of an identity closest to our truest of truths, our species, our humanity? Well, that's a big one. So, in this short video, I'll try to pose two questions that might get us closer to understanding at least 1% of our relationship to this organic yet strangely utopian idea. 1. What's been historically and systematically stopping us from developing such a project? 2. How might the most progressive version of such a project look like, and why it is, in fact, good? Now, I understand this discussion might seem silly to many of you. You have much bigger problems to deal with, like paying rent, raising kids, being raised as kids, or taking care of God knows how much debt you might have accrued. But that shouldn't wrap you in a bubble of cynicism so thick that you can't bother to dream of a better future outside of fiction consumed for entertainment. Remember, if we had never dared, we'd still be fighting over caves with rocks. So a dream, no matter how far it might seem to us, and our current problems, can still be used as a guiding star as we traverse this eternal ocean of the unknown. And on the other side of the spectrum, I know many of you hold great pride in your nation, your culture, or your creed. So someone proposing a united planet might seem either insane, difficult to comprehend, or personally offensive. And to those, all I ask is you sit through the video, and I'll do my best to make sure your grievances, but more importantly, your need to feel a part of something greater, end up being addressed. So yeah, a video about a united species. I know I'm not exactly being the definition of modest here, but my Homo sapiens patriotism can no longer be held at bay. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of division? Either you're a nerd and you just said maths, or you're a nerd and you just said divide and conquer. Divide et impera, a classic quote usually attributed to Philip II of Macedon. The concept is rather simple. A large, united people, political organization, culture, you name it, can be sabotaged and even destroyed by inspiring division amongst its members. Once the larger whole is separated into smaller units, it's much easier for you to either pick them off one by one or consume them in their totality. It's far simpler to defeat a larger standing army that's got rockets pointed at each other instead of only at you. The simplest of maths. I guess both the nerds were correct, I guess. Now, why am I throwing around ancient bro slang? Because at its core, that's the answer to this whole question. We remain divided because we are easier to control, manipulate, and rule. Oh, and there's like a lot of money in making us fight each other. And I know, some of you are screaming about how we already have institutions like the United Nations. Sure, a great first step towards a grander idea of human cooperation. I'm glad we have it, but an institution is only as relevant as the power it can exert, and as long as certain individual nation-states carry more power and influence, both diplomatic and military, than the UN, then its relevance is respectfully more symbolic than practical. But how do we get here? What's this nation-state thing? Well, contrary to popular pop culture beliefs, people don't think up ideas because they want to exclusively screw other people over. Quite to the contrary, ideas, beliefs, and ideologies often come from a place of vision for a better future. And so did good old nationalism. But nationalism, just like any other ideological current, often ends up outliving its usefulness and sometimes even causing harm, both directly and over a longer period of time on average. So, in this particular case, the story, oversimplified, went something like this. Man says God gave him right to be king. Everyone says, wait, for real, I guess we're doing this for a while now. People get the shit worked out of them on the land the king owns. King gives them scraps. King and his wider family of royals live it up super champagne orgy style, just nobody has shaved armpits and it all smells very, very weird. General population, including peasants, workers, and the now relatively wealthy merchant class, says, what the fuck, this makes no sense, why did we do this for so long? King tells them to eat cake. They kill King. Okay, country is now no longer just owned by one guy who thinks he's good friends with the big G, so what's going to keep the fabric of society from falling apart? Well, a bunch of economic and legislative systems that the narrator has better videos on, but more relevant for the topic, nationalism. What makes a country is that it's shared among people of the same, people. And there we have it, a brilliantly oversimplified beginning of nationalism, the nation-state and national revolution. Beautiful, isn't it? Used to this day by peoples who want to liberate themselves from colonizers, monarchs, and oppressive foreign occupiers, right? Well, yes, when used as a liberatory tool, nationalism has provided us a world with far more rational social glue that keeps civilization together. A people's country, so to say. But then, nationalism also gave us this. Nationalism has outlived its usefulness. What united us as nations is now used as a cudgel for hate, unscientific ideas of superiority, and as a great motivator for the less well-read masses for war and conflict. A tool once used to bring city-states, religious groups, and social classes together has now been hijacked as an argument for division, isolation, bigotry through ignorance, and much more. Large imperial powers don't allow the growth of the global south because they see them as growing competition. One part of the world outsources its pollution to another, thinking they won't feel the effects, while our shared planet strongly disagrees. Questions of massive financial hoarding of wealth by the few are brushed away as the many point fingers at each other and fight for the scraps. Divide et impera. We dehumanize the other because they don't salute the same flag. We bastardize ourselves by saying American first, Mexican first, Slovak first, human second. A social tool, the nation, has embedded itself in our minds so much that for some it now carries greater significance than our humanity. Us versus them. Everything is us versus them. Well, there's only a them and an us because we chose to believe it. It's a massive global gaslight that has convinced you and me that we don't share the same interests across borders. And if you believe that countries are a natural concept, they are not. Community is. Culture is. Thinking another member of your species is different or less important than you because they happen to have been born 1,000 kilometers away from you is literal lunacy. Monkeys and wolves organize in groups to get food and defeat predators because they only scavenge to survive. We, on the other hand, learned to produce. That all the necessary instinct to group together to survive is real, but somehow only used to motivate us to unite up to a point in the nation, the tribe, or whatever else. Never to bring those nations and tribes together. We Americans or we Chinese need to be united in order to survive outside threats is a classic. We Americans and Chinese need to unite in order to survive global threats sounds like it's straight out of a utopian sci-fi film. But it shouldn't. The many warring city-states of what we call Italy today would have probably passed out from learning that in the 21st century they're all one united country. Historical consolidation implies just that. Human societies have progressed from tribes to city-states to nation-states. This pattern suggests that larger and more integrated political units are the next logical step. It's okay for you to feel woozy when even thinking about it. Our tribal and city-state ancestors did too. But that didn't stop us from thinking that all we have ever known is going to be all we will ever know. History ends with no one generation, and that right there is our strength, to dream something our great-grandkids could actually achieve. Look at our generation, for example. We continue the great technological leap, minimizing and hopefully one day removing the need for man to see man as predator anymore. That being said, this instinct for self-preservation will never disappear, so I'm not asking you to ignore it. To the contrary, please follow through on it, because if we trust it, but fully trust it, we know that deep down on a planet with finite resources and technology that can help us all utilize their maximum potential, global cooperation will help us self-preserve far more than division and war. So yes, if you're individualist or you love community, if you believe it's human nature to do anything to self-preserve, or if you put the needs of others ahead of yours, it is in all our interest to feed and grow a pan-human identity over that of hundreds of countries. It is both a matter of want as well as survival. Okay, we're already setting ourselves up for failure with a question as large as this. So, to make things simpler, I'll give you my view on the early stages of a sustainable, progressive world union. Most of these concepts come from plenty of different ideological currents: internationalism, socialism, humanism, as well as classic academic political science works like that of Alexander Wendt, or if we go back far enough, even Hegel. It's also very interesting that there is no real term for pro-unification theory, as it's always been considered just an aspect of other political theories and not worthy of a term of its own. And while I agree that just proposing unity for unity's sake is an idealist platitude, I find that not giving a concept with such world-changing weight a name is also too simplistic. So let's call it Unitas Mundi, Latin for unity of the world, which should of course be adapted to the ancient languages of every corner of the world. Unitas Mundi. In order to tackle the question of how this Unitas Mundi would look like, we need a starting point. As the highest form of social organization at this point in history is the nation-state, and it's pretty much all we know, let's take its core principles and quite literally scale them up. So, what are those? Well, the way a state is governed, the economic system it follows, and the less talked about but equally important principle for this conversation, culture and a people's way of life. So, governance, economy, and culture. According to historian Alexander Wendt, just as nation-states emerged by centralizing control over violence within a territory, a world state will emerge by centralizing military and coercive power on a global scale. In a world without a higher authority, the way it is right now, states seek to ensure their own survival, leading them to create institutions that protect their own sovereignty and that of its own dominant classes. The scale-up of this scenario, at least in its founding, is likely to follow historic patterns, the way city-states organized into allied territories and eventually unified into what we now define as countries. The slow and often peaceful process of joining interstate organizations, which allow for free movement of people, goods, and ideas, eventually lead to a breaking point in which the functional benefits of the larger union outweigh the costs of sovereignty. In our past, city-states came together and formed federations, unions, or just straight-up centralized governments. The theory goes that this same process can be replicated for a wider union between countries into pan-unions, and eventually formal unification of those as well. Obviously, this is just theory on the best-case scenario. As we know, things rarely go perfectly for our species, but the argument that problems like climate change, nuclear proliferation, or imperialism cannot be effectively addressed by individual states is a fact we live every day. So, how an eventual unified Terran government is formed will be dictated by history, likely following the previously mentioned historical patterns our species has exhibited in its drive to unification. So, it is less a matter of how and more of when, before it's too late. But okay, let's say it does happen. What would governance look like? As I said earlier, in the beginning, we scale up. Just as we have sovereignty over the governance of countries and cities today, with mayors, domestic councils, and so on, we can have a similar system in place for the territorial sectors of the wider pan-human system tomorrow. So, just as the people of Berlin decide what happens to Berlin, they also share a budget with all of Germany. They also can't just go and take over a neighboring village and call it Berlin too. They might have a thriving industrial sector, but without the agri-sector of the periphery, they'll never have enough food, etc., etc. Their membership in the wider union, Germany, is what benefits Berlin and Germany as a whole. It's a win-win. The futuristic idea of the wider human union simply seeks to scale this up. While the sectors will have as much sovereignty as practicality allows, including representation in the central governing body of the union, just as a modern county does today, they will also have responsibilities to said union. And if you're sitting there confused on why one would abandon their sovereignty for the benefit of a larger whole while also benefiting from said whole, I simply ask you to follow through on that logic. Why should Berlin feed the rest of Germany when they have their shit together? Just file for independence. Hell, one of Berlin's neighborhoods is outperforming all the other ones. Maybe it should file for independence too. No. There's a particular factory that produces more than any other one inside of that neighborhood. Should it also file for independence? This is the logic of an antisocial child that has never built anything in their life. Try to build a bridge without a lot of workers. You can't, right? Well, it's the same when trying to create a civilization from a disconnected neighborhood. It is impossible. The only reason you don't obsess over city sovereignty or neighborhood sovereignty the way you might over the nation state is because that's what's been normalized for you. That's your ideological bias screaming. But hopefully the little allegory up there I just gave you should have helped. Because if you think sovereignty for sovereignty's sake is always good, then go put a flag on top of your house and declare it an independent country. If followed through, that's where logic like that leads. If not, open yourself up. The same way you can love your city, work for your city, care for your city, while also being a part of a larger whole. You can love your people, work for your nation, care for your land, while also being a part of an even larger whole. The two are not mutually exclusive. Hell, it's to the contrary. But okay, that's enough on the ideology of world governance. How do I see the formal structure looking like? Well, here I'd like to borrow Dr. Vent's outlook again, but add a bit of necessary non-academic spice. The world state would function much like a federal system, with regional and local governments retaining some degree of autonomy, global, regional, and local, similar to current federal systems. Different regions or states might elect representatives to a central global legislative body, ensuring that their voices are heard in decision-making. Regions or states might be represented based on population, but mechanisms would exist to prevent smaller states from being overshadowed entirely by larger ones. Citizens would have global rights protected by the world state, such as basic human rights, environmental protections, and access to resources. Political participation at all levels would be encouraged, possibly through institutions like a global parliament. A global judiciary would interpret laws and ensure justice, similar to how national courts operate within countries today. Enforcement would likely rely on a global security force or police under the control of the world state to ensure compliance without favoritism. The world state would respect cultural, religious, and regional differences, ensuring that no single culture dominates. Decisions would be made at the lowest appropriate level, with the world government stepping in only for issues that transcend regional boundaries, such as global security or climate change. And that's pretty much it. As time passes, this will gradually lead to a full integration of the federal states into one body, where our history of interspecies competition on the basis of nation will seem like a distant, strange, and violent past, the way city-states or tribes feel to us now. Most global issues driven by state competition will be resolved through this new system. Nuclear proliferation, environmentally unsustainable policies and industries, exploitation of less developed states by imperial powers, and lots more will likely become a thing of the past because, well, it won't be necessary. And if there are bad actors, they'll have a united planet with systems of checks and balances put in place to combat them. Okay, I'm sure that the more economically progressive among you have been patiently waiting for this part of the manifesto, and you would be correct to do so, because most actions undertaken by a state are motivated by the domestic and foreign needs generated by the economic system it finds itself in, especially that of the highest grossing members of its state. Well, the previous part of this conversation showed how a world union addresses issues that arise from the existence of modern nation-state governance. This section has an even more important job. It needs to answer how a world union can address issues created by our current economic model. And that's the interesting part. It can't. Yes, you heard me right. A world state can't even exist under the current economic system. Why? Because most of the world currently finds itself in neoliberal capitalism. In capitalism, there is one overarching rule. Profit is king. The success of an endeavor, a firm, a conglomerate, or even a state is defined by how quickly and how much surplus value, profit, it can generate. In such a system, over time, more and more money is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. At the moment of the writing of this video, 81 billionaires have more wealth than 50% of the world combined. 81 billionaires. This imbalance of power between those with so much capital, which snowballs into even more capital, and those with nothing, who struggle to achieve the bare minimum, should be an unsurpassable moral indignation of the system on a moral, spiritual, and practical scientific basis. But even leaving all that to the side, it is systematically impossible to advocate for planetary unification when the wealthiest, most powerful, and most influential people in the world have a vested interest in the opposite. Divide et impera from earlier, but with a class distinction. This isn't even a moral argument, it's reality. In modern capitalism, the only people who decide are the titans of industry, and they have absolutely no interest in pursuing what we're talking about here. The dream of a united species is impossible when the most powerful subsection of said species literally profits from their division. The only way to remove this obstacle is to remove the very system which allows for a subsection of the species to yield so much power. Therefore, I'm sorry to say to most liberals and conservatives in this audience, without the replacement of the capitalist system, our species is doomed to petty divisions, and our dreams of the stars will only ever be just that, dreams, or, ironically, for-profit shows. But okay, these are pretty open conclusions. Can we have details, you might ask? Well, sure. Let me give you some reasons capitalists don't want a unified future. Oversimplified. Number one is that they wouldn't exist. As I said earlier, with this system, a unified species is impossible. But for the other examples, let's imagine it is. They would still be screwed. A unified planet would lead to standardized regulations and labor laws, which might erode the competitive advantages that wealthy capitalists currently enjoy by exploiting disparities between different parts of the world. Think sweatshops and lower wages in the developing world, wars for resources, outsourcing, dumping of toxic waste abroad, the list goes on. Without these, the line goes down. We can't ever have the line go down. Unified global governance would impose supremely strict regulations on industries and environmental standards, totally reducing profit margins for businesses that currently pollute out the wazoo. I always wanted to say that. Out the wazoo, yeah. Sorry, apologies. Next. Wealthy capitalists often have significant influence over national governments. A unified planet could dilute their power and control, as decision-making would shift to a global authority that might not be as easily influenced by individual wealth or corporate interests. A unified planet could lead to the creation of a single global currency or centralized economic planning, which might disrupt existing financial systems and markets that wealthy capitalists have mastered and profited from. And finally, this is a big one, no tax havens. Like, I think just this one would make the capitalists rather cause nuclear Armageddon than see unification. These examples are just me scratching the surface, but I think you're smart enough to get the point. Capitalism equals no unified planet. When it comes to the economic model of what is to come, it will depend on the post-capitalist system which is won out before the wider species unification begins. In my personal belief, this economy will likely necessitate a hyper-technological socialist central planning system, which maximizes the utility out of all of our planetary resources, labor, intellect, tech, and what will now be called global industry for minimal environmental damage and maximum on average output for the elevation of everyone's life standards. This, of course, will be no easy feat, but to repeat myself, if we could crawl out of the cave to now conquer the skies, we can find a superior model for the management of a people's economy. And we will. But for those of you asking what's in it for me, Well, how about you or your kids never go to war because there's no them to go to war against? How about full value for the work you put in, not just scraps your boss tosses you? Full freedom of movement, but also the privilege to stay and develop your own community as its resources are no longer plundered by some faraway land you'll never see. How about access to every advancement of every category independent of how far from you it's coming from? How about having more purpose in life than hoarding money and competing over who has more? How about dignity for you and your species? Let's face it, we have little to none today. Dignity, the ability to speak about fellow man as a whole and not have to follow that through with is evil, with is corrupt. Imagine that. Dignity. Hopefully, at this point, I've convinced most of you that there are far greater benefits to a united world than flaws in terms of economic systems and governance. But some of you might still hold reservations about the idea, especially if you're from parts of the world that have had their identity often not only questioned, but even violently removed by the boot of plunder, empire, and conquest. I mean, I get it. The only idea of a unified world with the current system in place would look something like the British Empire on which the sun never set. Colonialism, occupation, and resource extraction. Nobody wants that, but how then, you might rightfully ask, can we unite without one particular culture or way of life dominating all others? Well, fellow Terrans, let's try and figure that out. A unified species aiming to preserve cultural diversity while fostering a global human identity would need to balance respect for local traditions with the promotion of shared values. Here are some strategies it might employ. Number 1, cultural autonomy. Regions and communities are granted the right to govern their cultural, linguistic, and religious practices, ensuring local traditions are respected and maintained. Local governments wouldn't simply deal with the economy, but the appropriate representation of their constituents' culture as well, similar to how cities do that now in state governments. 2. Resources are provided for the funding of protection of endangered languages, traditions, and heritage sites, ensuring they are documented and celebrated. Education systems will teach with equal value both local history, language, and traditions alongside global curricula, fostering pride both in cultural and wider human identity. Global exchange programs would have a far greater role than they do today in order to allow people to share and learn about different cultures, fostering mutual respect and understanding. Enforcement of policies that protect the land, resources, and rights of indigenous peoples will ensure their ways of life are not eroded by unification. The integration of global citizenship into education systems, teaching the interconnectedness of humanity and the importance of collective responsibility. Development of shared symbols, holidays, and rituals that celebrate humanity's union without overshadowing local traditions. This, in the long term, will show just how many of the cultural norms we have are shared across vastly distant peoples of the world. Ensure that all individuals, regardless of culture, have equal access to all guaranteed human rights as defined by the Union. Creation of entire branches of government dedicated to ongoing dialogue between cultures and peoples, encouraging collaboration and understanding while addressing conflicts and misunderstandings. Think UN peacekeeping, but actual funding and expertise. Environmental protection will be correctly framed as a shared human responsibility, uniting people across cultures into one against a true common threat. Reduction of global inequalities by adequately distributing resources and opportunities, ensuring that no culture or community is marginalized or exploited. Diverse cultural representation will be ensured and mandated in global institutions, so all voices are heard and respected in decision-making processes. Refer to the governance section for more on this. Finally, the main cultural pitch of the Union will be to encourage the idea that individuals can embrace both their local cultural identity and a global human identity, without one negating the other. By combining these theoretical approaches, which stem from many different ideological and philosophical schools of thought, a unified world could create a system that honors the richness of human diversity while fostering a sense of shared purpose and identity for all humanity. Would it likely hit problems as it's applied to the real world? Of course, especially in the beginning, mostly stemming from cultures which for one reason or another define themselves as superior instead of only different. Centuries of cultural imperialism will take time to slowly die off. In the long term, many cultures, the same way it's been throughout our entire history up until this point, will merge, become one, create new ways of life. So we must remember, that's not death. It's the birth of something new. Just think about how many different places many of the things you love the most come from. All over the world, right? That is not death. That is humanity. Hell, unitas mundi might be our only path towards some form of cultural preservation left. Without systems put in place to encourage us to learn about our own way of life and those of others, the dominant culture of whatever state finds itself at the top of the current geopolitical or economic model is what overtakes all else. Question for the non-Americans listening to or reading this. Haven't you noticed that most of you work like Americans, eat like Americans, dress like Americans, even to an extent think like Americans? Now, while there's absolutely nothing wrong with liking or even adapting a new way of life to yours every day, why is it that no other faraway culture is so prevalent in your life? I doubt you're as knowledgeable of Tibetan meditation techniques, have 3 Kenyan restaurants in your neighborhood, or want to throw Brazilian carnivals in your hometown. In a highly competitive system such as global capitalism, where competing states battle it out, it is inevitable for one empire to eventually overshadow everyone else, both militarily and economically. But what's less talked about is the drive towards complete cultural globalization as well. Not through the equal mingling and growth of every perspective, but a domineering imperialist force imposed with little to no alternative. With Unitas Mundi, there will be no greater or lesser culture, and information about the many ways we like to live our lives will be spread like a web across the planet, instead of a beam being cast to the whole world from only one place. But there are also ways of life that will be incompatible with a union of this proportion, where the hand of understanding will not be extended. Norms and customs that break with the union's definition of accepted human rights and treatment of man by man will not be tolerated, period. Think child brides, forced marriage, segregation, and bigotry on the basis of gender, sexuality, and so on. And finally, I don't think this will be as big of a problem in the modern context as many make it out to be. In a pre-internet era where physical distance meant real distance between peoples, that might have been true. But imagine taking the power of the internet away from individual, corporate, or state actors and allowing, with a few caveats of course, the complete free flow of communication through the world. 5 days worth of American and Chinese interaction on the app called Red Note during the TikTok ban scare saw such incredible understanding being shared amongst two peoples who had been taught to stereotype and despise each other for decades. Their separation, which made misunderstanding and propagated hatred possible, was almost lifted overnight through direct contact. Millions became one. The more we talk, the more we understand that we don't only share similar cultural norms, ways of life, but the truest, most core identity of them all, our humanity. The more barriers we remove, the more apparent that truth becomes. And I can't think of a bigger barrier than a species divided. Culture, government, economy. We've explored these 3 categories from the subjective perspective of where humanity is right now and on a relatively surface level. From the perspective of citizens of nation-states, hostages of capitalism, and the results of cultural imperialism. These are simple directives on how Unitas Mundi could look like or come to be. If you'd like me to develop the theory and perspectives further, please do tell me in the comments, subscribe, or consider supporting my Patreon and reaching out to me there with ideas. As I've said earlier, nobody before us had the privilege of having the internet, so let's utilize it as a global tool for a global community. Our future is uncertain, maybe more than ever, or maybe that's what every generation said. I am not sure of many things, but the human drive towards greater civilizational leaps is undeniable and coded in our history. To believe this is our peak, an invisible dot floating through space filled with apes who no longer fight over bananas on trees, but bananas on flags, is simplistic and treasonous to our very humanity. All human-made systems which stand in the way of Unitas Mundi must be recognized as no longer serving greater human interest and disbanded or replaced. They are to be treated as anti-human because that is exactly what they are. A world and species united is our destiny, an idea that millions have explored before us and billions will in the future, continuing with you and me. Unitas Mundi. Hi again. Sorry, I know you're still processing the last part, but this is important. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'm now partnered with Means TV, and in your own way, I think you should be too. Now, don't click away. This is not just another ad about service number 5634. It's partially about our future. If you're not already familiar with Means, it's a fully worker-owned, explicitly anti-capitalist streaming service. You can find everything from videos styled like my own to serious, full-feature documentaries, regular news shows, original series. Hell, there's even cartoons. Now, I know there's plenty of streaming services out there fighting for your time and your money, promising educational content, entertainment, and community, but they are all inherently corrupted, ran by exclusively for-profit content-churning machines that answer to this megacorp or the other. Means TV is run by working people, for working people, through a system as close to a socialist one as it can currently get. It is a necessary alternative and failsafe for an ever-encroaching censorship machine against class-conscious, anti-establishment media. It's our chance to develop a safe space where the big man can never get us, free of corporate guidelines, advertising-friendly self-censorship, and all forms of bootlicking. So, to start building up this digital home of ours, I'll throw in 20% off your first month or even the whole annual subscription, either of which you can start after 7 days free. Oh, and as I said, it's a worker co-op, so if you sign up through my link, you'll be supporting me personally too, as all revenue is divided by everyone who contributes. So check it out. Let's show them our model can work.